At 61, Keanu Reeves is still treated like a modern myth, the rare Hollywood name people say with relief, as if decency itself had a face and it happened to wear his. The strange part is that the world keeps framing him as an exception, the kind man, the humble star, the quiet hero. But the closer you look, the more it feels like his gentleness was never a personality quirk. It was an after effect. The disciplined posture of someone who learned early that life does not negotiate. He was born on September 1964 in Beirut, and the word home never had the chance to become solid under his feet for long. His parents split when he was very young. His childhood moved across cities, and by the time he was 13, he last saw his father, a final meeting that left the kind of silence that does not end. It just becomes part of your breathing. What people read as calm in Keanu, that unhurried way he speaks, the way he avoids spectacle, can look like confidence, but it can also be something else. The emotional skill of a kid who had to become steady because the adults around him could not be. That is the first thread of the tragedy, not one headline moment, but a lifelong training in impermanence. And then, when the world finally gave him what most people chase, visibility, power, the kind of fame that can bend an industry, it did not arrive as rescue. It arrived as a stage where he had to keep performing strength while the private part of his life kept insisting on loss. In October 1993, River Phoenix died at just 23 outside the Viper Room in West Hollywood, an event that did not only end a friendship, it rewrote what the future felt like for everyone who loved him. Keanu rarely turns grief into public theater, but that does not mean it passed through him gently. The shape of his later performances, the stillness behind the action, the pause after the line, the way sorrow seems to sit inside the character even when the script does not name it. It all starts to make a different kind of sense when you accept that he was carrying absence long before the world called him a legend. Then comes the chapter that turns the idea of tragedy from narrative into fracture. In late 1999, Keanu and Jennifer Syme were expecting a child, and on December 24th, their daughter was stillborn. You do not need graphic detail for a moment like that, because the human mind fills it in automatically. A room prepared, a future imagined, a silence that arrives and replaces all the noise. Their grief strained the relationship, and in 2001, Jennifer Syme died in a car accident, a second blow that did not just take a person, it took the last bridge back to the version of life that might have been. This is the point where many people would harden, where cynicism would be understandable, even expected, but Keanu's public reputation moved in the opposite direction over time, as if loss taught him to treat people gently, because he already knew how quickly a normal day can become an after. Around all of this, another kind of fear ran alongside his career, slower, more exhausting, the long vigilance of illness in the family. His sister Kim was diagnosed with leukemia in 1991 and fought it for years before going into remission, a period where Keanu was not just a famous brother. He was a caretaker, present in the ways that do not photograph, well, the kind of devotion that happens under fluorescent hospital lights. Not premieres. And here's where the story becomes more unsettling, because the tragedy is not only what happened to him, it is what he kept doing anyway. The audience sees Neo defy physics, John Wick survive what no body should survive, but the real Keanu has been negotiating with time in quieter ways, managing pain, managing grief, managing the constant risk that the people you love can be taken without warning. Even his body has started to show the bill for decades of commitment. In 2024, while working on Aziz Ansari's film Good Fortune, he fractured his kneecap after slipping and described it as cracking like a potato chip, an almost absurdly ordinary accident that lands with symbolic weight when you realize he is an action icon whose real opponent is no longer a villain. It is wear and tear. So when a video says the tragedy of Keanu Reeves is beyond heartbreaking, the most honest hook is not to stack sad events like trophies, it is to ask what kind of person stays open after life repeatedly teaches the same brutal lesson, that nothing is guaranteed, not family, not love, not health, not even the body that carries your dreams. At 61, the defining chapter is not that he suffered, It is that he refuses to let suffering become his identity, and that refusal has a cost, because it requires daily control over the darkest instinct humans have, the instinct to shut down and stop caring. By the time Keanu Reeves entered adulthood, he was already carrying a lifetime's worth of lessons about loss, instability, and endurance. Long before Hollywood ever tested him, life had. His childhood was not marked by a single catastrophic event, but by something quieter and more corrosive: constant displacement. Different cities, different schools, different temporary homes, and a revolving door of adult figures who never stayed long enough to feel permanent. This kind of upbringing does not always produce rebellion or chaos. More often, it produces vigilance. A child who learns early that nothing is fixed becomes someone who watches closely, listens more than he speaks, and avoids emotional excess because excess feels dangerous. That vigilance would later be mistaken for humility, mystery, or even aloofness, but at its core, it was survival. School was not a refuge. Keanu struggled with dyslexia, which turned reading into a daily confrontation with frustration and embarrassment. Words did not behave the way teachers expected them to, and classrooms are rarely forgiving to children who do not fit cleanly into the system. He moved through several high schools in a short span of time, never staying long enough to build roots. Teachers often misread his curiosity as disruption. Authority figures interpreted his constant questions as defiance rather than confusion or hunger for understanding. One principal famously expelled him for asking too many questions, an act that sounds almost absurd, yet perfectly illustrates how systems punish difference when they do not know how to accommodate it. Keanu was not rebellious by nature. He was trying to make sense of a world that kept shifting under his feet. The one place where clarity existed was the ice rink. Hockey became the first structure that felt honest to him. The rules were clear. The feedback was immediate. Effort mattered. As a goalie, known by teammates as the Wall, Keanu found an identity built on focus and resilience. The position itself was symbolic, the last line of defense, absorbing impact after impact, standing alone while chaos rushed forward. On the ice, he was no longer the kid with half-packed suitcases or unreadable textbooks. He was present, anchored, and necessary. He dreamed of playing in the Ontario Hockey League, even of representing Canada one day. For the first time, the future felt like something he could hold. Then, at 15, that future collapsed. A serious injury ended his hockey aspirations abruptly. There was no long farewell, no gradual transition. One moment, the dream existed, the next it did not. For most teenagers, losing a sport is disappointing. For Keanu, it was existential. Hockey was not just an activity. It was stability, identity, and direction. Its sudden disappearance reinforced a lesson life had already taught him repeatedly. Whatever you rely on can be taken without warning. That realization could have broken him. Instead, it redirected him. With hockey gone, Keanu drifted toward performance almost by instinct. Acting offered something hockey no longer could: transformation. On stage and later on camera, he could step into stories that gave shape to feelings he had never been able to articulate. Dyslexia, which made school unbearable, became less of an obstacle in acting. Scripts could be learned slowly, rehearsed, embodied. The camera did not demand speed, it demanded truth. Acting did not erase his pain, but it gave it somewhere to go. Leaving school without a diploma labeled him a misfit, another mark against him in a world that values credentials. But by then, Keanu had learned that labels rarely tell the full story. He packed what little he had, including a battered car and a fragile sense of hope, and drove toward Los Angeles. The city did not welcome him warmly. Early years were defined by bare apartments, financial anxiety, and relentless rejection. Auditions came and went. Doors stayed closed. Casting agents could not decide what he was supposed to be. Too soft for one role, too strange for another, not polished enough to fit clean archetypes. These years were not glamorous. They were transactional, exhausting, and lonely. Keanu took whatever work he could find: small television roles, commercials, children's programming. None of it promised a future. All of it required persistence. But persistence was something he understood. Survival had already trained him for it. Each rejection felt familiar, echoing earlier dismissal from schools and authority figures. He learned not to take no personally, because if he did, he would not last. What set him apart during this period was not confidence, but endurance. He did not demand recognition. He did not perform entitlement. He simply kept showing up. Slowly, subtly, that consistency began to register. In independent films, particularly darker, more uncomfortable ones, critics started to notice something unusual, a depth that did not feel manufactured. The grief he portrayed on screen did not look like technique. It looked lived in. He was not acting sorrow. He was translating it. This phase of his life is essential to understanding everything that came later. Before the world ever called him a star, Keanu had already internalized the idea that nothing is owed. Fame did not arrive as validation. It arrived as another uncertain structure that could collapse at any time. That is why success never softened him into arrogance. It simply became another environment he learned to navigate carefully. By the time opportunity truly began to open for him, Keanu Reeves was not an empty vessel waiting to be filled by Hollywood. He was already full, carrying disappointment, loss, discipline, and restraint. Those qualities did not make him shine immediately, but they made him durable. And durability, not brilliance, is what would ultimately allow him to survive what was still ahead. By the early 1990s, Keanu Reeves was no longer just surviving Hollywood. He was standing inside it, though never comfortably. He entered that decade as an outsider who had slipped through the gates without fully belonging to the system that now watched him closely. Tall, quiet, difficult to categorize, he did not project the aggressive confidence studios liked to market. Instead, he carried a restrained intensity that confused executives and intrigued directors. His early success did not erase doubt. It sharpened it. With every role, the question followed him. Was he a real actor, or just a passing image the audience happened to like? That tension defined the period. Films like Point Break showed his ability to fuse physical action with emotional vulnerability. He was not playing invincible heroes. He was playing men who felt uncertainty beneath the adrenaline. Even as the action surged forward, there was always something reflective in his eyes, a pause that suggested thought rather than domination. Critics began to sense depth, but the industry hesitated to trust it. Hollywood prefers clarity, and Keanu remained ambiguous. Then came Speed, the film that detonated his public image overnight. Suddenly, he was everywhere. Posters, interviews, late-night shows, magazine covers. The industry finally decided what he was, a star. Yet this moment, which should have been pure triumph, revealed one of the defining fractures of his career. When offered a massive paycheck to return for Speed, Keanu said no. It was not a dramatic rejection, not a public protest. He simply chose a stage role instead, prioritizing growth over momentum. That single decision carried consequences far beyond the film itself. Hollywood has a long memory for refusal. The label followed him quietly but persistently. Difficult, ungrateful, unreliable. The punishment was subtle but effective. Scripts slowed. Offers cooled. Projects he took on were scrutinized more harshly. Films like Johnny Mnemonic and Chain Reaction underperformed, and critics sharpened their knives. The narrative shifted. He was no longer the promising depth actor or the action breakthrough. He was suddenly wooden, limited, lucky. These words mattered, not because they were true, but because they echoed something deeply familiar to him, being misunderstood by systems that did not know how to read him. What the public rarely understood was that these professional blows landed on a man already carrying enormous personal weight. In 1993, River Phoenix died suddenly, and with him disappeared the one person in Hollywood who felt like family. Their bond had been built on shared vulnerability, on a mutual recognition of darkness beneath the surface. River's death was not just grief, it was destabilization. It reinforced the lesson Keanu had learned repeatedly. when something finally feels safe, it is often about to disappear. Keanu did not turn this loss into spectacle. He did not build a narrative around it. Instead, it sank inward, and that inward turn shaped his performances. The sorrow audiences began to notice on screen was not an artistic choice layered on top of technique. It was residue. It was absence finding expression. Then, in 1999, everything changed again. The Matrix arrived not as a gentle correction, but as a cultural rupture. Keanu Reeves became Neo, and Neo became a symbol for an entire generation questioning reality, control, and identity. The role demanded more than acting. It demanded physical transformation. Training was brutal. Martial arts, wire work, repetitive choreography that punished the body relentlessly. Keanu suffered serious injuries during preparation, including damage to his neck that required surgery. Even while recovering, he continued training, wearing braces while learning fight sequences. On screen, Neo bent physics. Off-screen, Keanu bent himself to the edge of his limits. The world applauded the result, but the applause masked the cost. Every movement carried pain. Every take demanded endurance. Yet even as The Matrix cemented him as a global icon, the familiar whispers returned. Critics praised the film while questioning him. Was he replaceable? Was the performance carried by technology? Was he simply lucky again? This contradiction became the defining paradox of his career. Massive success paired with persistent doubt. For many actors, such doubt breeds bitterness or defensiveness. Keanu responded differently. He worked harder. He accepted the discomfort. He allowed the criticism to exist without letting it define him. The years following The Matrix were uneven. Sequels, experiments, smaller films. He never chased prestige aggressively, nor did he cling to superstardom. Instead, he moved laterally, exploring roles that interested him, even when they confused audiences. That willingness to drift, rather than anchor himself to a single persona, kept him misunderstood but intact. Then, when much of Hollywood had quietly begun to move on, something unexpected happened. In 2014, John Wick arrived. The film was modest in scale, but precise in execution. Keanu did not play Wick as a loud Avenger. He played him as a man hollowed out by grief. The violence was not spectacle. It was expression. Audiences responded immediately. What began as a small revenge thriller became a modern myth. The preparation for John Wick was punishing. Firearms training, driving courses, relentless choreography. Keanu insisted on performing as much as possible himself. His body absorbed the impact. Bruises accumulated. Joints protested. But something had shifted. This time, the narrative aligned. The character's grief mirrored the actor's history. The endurance required on screen reflected the endurance he had lived with for decades. As the franchise grew, so did the physical toll. By the fourth film, Keanu's body carried decades of accumulated damage. Knees worn down, tendons stiff, recovery slower. Yet he continued, not because he needed to prove anything, but because the work mattered to him. He treated the audience with respect, refusing shortcuts even when his body begged for them. This is the quiet truth of Keanu Reeves' third act. His greatest resurgence did not erase his tragedy. It was built on top of it. Every success layered itself over old wounds rather than replacing them. The world saw reinvention. Keanu experienced continuation. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that his career was never about ascent alone. It was about persistence, about staying present in a system that repeatedly misread him, about carrying grief without letting it rot into cruelty. And as the applause grew louder again, so did the question that would define the next chapter of his life. What happens when endurance meets time and the body that carried everything finally begins to ask for mercy? By the time Keanu Reeves reached his late 30s, tragedy stopped arriving as isolated events and began arriving as a pattern. This is where his story shifts from struggle into something heavier, something that no amount of professional success could counterbalance. Fame was no longer theoretical. He had achieved the kind of global recognition most actors spend their lives chasing. And yet, just as his career reached a new level of stability, his private life began to unravel in ways that would permanently alter how he related to love, hope, and the idea of a future. Keanu had always been cautious with intimacy. Loss had trained him to protect his heart long before adulthood. But in the late 1990s, he allowed himself to believe in something more permanent. His relationship with Jennifer Syme was not a spectacle. It wasn't paraded across red carpets or inflated into headlines. It was quiet, domestic, real. For someone whose childhood was defined by instability and whose adult life was dominated by constant motion, that quiet mattered. Jennifer represented not just love, but the possibility of home, a future that did not feel temporary. In 1999, that future seemed tangible. Jennifer became pregnant, and for the first time, Keanu was close to building the family he had never known. Friends later described this period as one of the few times he seemed openly hopeful. The idea of fatherhood was not an accessory to his life. It was redemption, proof that something lasting could still be created after so much absence. Then on Christmas Eve, everything collapsed. Their daughter was stillborn. There's no language that fully captures that kind of loss. It is not grief that explodes outward. It is grief that implodes, that hollow space where meaning used to live. A nursery prepared in love becomes a room no one can enter. Time does not soften this kind of pain, it distorts it. Keanu and Jennifer tried to survive it together, but grief is rarely symmetrical. It pulls people inward, sometimes in opposite directions. The loss fractured their relationship, not because love vanished, but because pain overwhelmed everything else. 2 years later, tragedy returned with a cruelty that felt almost deliberate. In 2001, Jennifer Syme died in a car accident. The woman who had carried his child, the person who shared his most devastating loss, was suddenly gone. For Keanu, this was not just another death. It was the erasure of an entire future. The family he had come closest to building disappeared completely. Those who witnessed him during this period often describe a man who moved through the world in near silence. Not dramatic, not performative, just diminished. At Jennifer's funeral, he carried her casket, his body visibly weighed down, not only by grief, but by finality. There would be no reunion, no healing conversation, no alternate ending. This moment marks a critical turning point in Keanu's emotional life. After Jennifer's death, he retreated further from public intimacy. Romance did not disappear from his life, but it became something guarded, private, almost sacred. He had learned, through unbearable experience, that hope itself could be dangerous. That loving deeply meant risking devastation without warning. What followed was not collapse, but transformation. Keanu did not numb himself through excess. He did not self-destruct. Instead, he became more restrained, more deliberate, more careful with people. His kindness did not fade, it sharpened. He treated relationships with reverence, as if aware that every moment could be the last ordinary one. Professionally, he continued working, even as grief followed him like a shadow. On screen, audiences began to notice something different. His performances carried weight even in silence. He did not need grand emotional displays. A pause, a look, a stillness communicated everything. This was not technique alone. It was lived experience leaking through. And tragedy was not finished reshaping him. Running parallel to these losses was another long, exhausting ordeal. His sister Kim's battle with leukemia. Unlike sudden death, illness demands endurance. It stretches fear over years. Keanu split his life between film sets and hospital rooms, between applause and fluorescent lights. He rearranged schedules, turned down opportunities, stayed close. In those moments, he was not an icon. He was a brother, exhausted and powerless in the face of something fame could not fix. This period explains much of what the public later celebrated as his humility. It was not modesty for effect. It was perspective forged under pressure. When you have watched someone you love fight for survival day after day, red carpets, lose their power to impress. When you have buried a child and carried the coffin of the woman you loved, attention becomes noise. Keanu did not speak often about these losses, and when he did, he used careful language. He once said that grief changes shape but never truly ends. That idea became the architecture of his life. He did not try to outrun sorrow. He learned to carry it without letting it poison him. This is why the phrase "beyond heartbreaking" applies not because of how much he lost, but because of what he did afterward. He continued to love. He continued to show up. He continued to treat people gently in a world that had given him every reason to withdraw. Part 4 of Keanu Reeves' story is not about tragedy as spectacle. It is about what remains after tragedy removes everything that felt solid. And what remained in him was not bitterness, not rage, not despair, but a quieter strength, a discipline of compassion, a decision made daily to live with an open heart even when life had proven how dangerous that could be. And that choice, more than any role he ever played, is what would define the rest of his journey. While the loss of Jennifer Syme and their child reshaped Keanu Reeves' understanding of love, another battle was unfolding at the same time, one that demanded a different kind of endurance. This tragedy did not arrive in a single devastating moment. It crept in slowly, stretching fear across years, forcing patience where panic wanted to take over. His younger sister Kim was diagnosed with leukemia, and from that moment on, Keanu's life existed in two parallel worlds that could not be reconciled. One was bright, loud, and artificial. The other was quiet, sterile, and brutally real. In public, he was becoming one of the most recognizable faces in cinema. On red carpets, he was Neo, the man who bent reality, the figure millions projected strength onto. In private, he was a brother sitting beside a hospital bed, watching someone he loved fight a disease that did not care about fame, money, or myth. This contrast was not poetic. It was exhausting. It required emotional compartmentalization on a level few people ever experience. Applause would fade, cameras would turn away, and he would walk into hallways filled with antiseptic smells and fluorescent light, where hope came in fragile increments measured by test results and whispered reassurances. Unlike sudden loss, illness demands sustained presence. There is no shock that passes quickly. There is only waiting. Waiting for updates. Waiting for treatments to work. Waiting for setbacks. This kind of waiting eats at a person's sense of control. Keanu rearranged his entire professional life around Kim's condition. Filming schedules were adjusted or abandoned without explanation. Opportunities were quietly declined. He bought a house close enough to ensure he could be there when needed. None of this was announced. None of it was framed as sacrifice. It was simply priority. Those who knew him during this period describe a man who grew even quieter, even more inward. He did not complain. He did not dramatize his exhaustion. He conserved energy emotionally and physically because there was no room for excess. His devotion showed itself in the smallest actions, reading aloud through long nights, sitting in silence, staying present when words were no longer useful. This was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was human, and it took a toll. Kim eventually went into remission, a word that sounds triumphant but rarely feels that way to those who live through the process. Remission does not erase fear. It does not restore innocence. It leaves scars that never fully heal, because once you understand how close death can come without warning, that knowledge does not leave you. For Keanu, this experience added another layer to a life already shaped by loss. He had known sudden devastation. Now he knew prolonged helplessness. Together, they formed a complete education in grief. Out of this period came something few people realized at the time, a quiet legacy of giving. Keanu began donating large sums of money to children's hospitals and cancer research. He helped fund treatment programs and supported institutions that had been there for his sister. But he did it without attaching his name. There were no press releases, no galas bearing his image, no public acknowledgement. His philanthropy was not a performance. It was gratitude. a way of repaying a debt to people who had fought to keep someone he loved alive. This anonymity was not accidental. It reflected how deeply his understanding of suffering had changed. When you have sat through endless hospital nights, recognition becomes meaningless. What matters is impact, whether someone else might be spared even a fraction of the helplessness you endured. His generosity became an extension of his grief, not a distraction from it. At the same time, his career continued, but it moved differently. Roles were chosen with care. Fame no longer dictated direction. He worked steadily, but without urgency. There was no sense of chasing relevance. Instead, he seemed anchored by something deeper than ambition. Audiences noticed his kindness, his humility, his quiet manners, and turned them into viral anecdotes. What they were seeing was not a carefully constructed persona. It was a man who had lost too much to waste energy on cruelty or ego. The public often asks how Keanu Reeves stayed gentle after everything he endured. The answer may be simpler and more unsettling than expected. He stayed gentle because he knew exactly how fragile people are. He had watched it up close. He had felt the weight of lives hanging in the balance. That awareness stripped away any illusion of superiority. When you know how quickly everything can collapse, you stop believing you are separate from anyone else's suffering. This phase of his life explains why his compassion feels authentic rather than rehearsed. It is not optimism. It is acceptance. He does not believe life will be fair. He believes it will be unpredictable, sometimes cruel, sometimes merciful, often both at once. And within that unpredictability, he chooses to act with care because care is one of the few things still within human control. By the end of this chapter, Keanu Reeves is no longer just a man marked by tragedy. He is a man shaped by responsibility. Responsibility to the people he loves. Responsibility to the memory of those he lost. Responsibility to use what he has, not to insulate himself from pain, but to reduce it where he can. This is why his story becomes increasingly difficult to reduce to a headline. The tragedy is not just that bad things happened to him. The tragedy is that he learned exactly how much suffering exists in the world and still chose to move through it without armor. And that choice, repeated quietly over years, prepared him for the next trial, one that could not be avoided, negotiated, or outpaced. The slow realization that even the body carrying all of this endurance has limits of its own. By his late 50s, Keanu Reeves had already survived more than most people endure in an entire lifetime. Emotional loss, private grief, long years of vigilance, and the constant pressure of public expectation had shaped him into someone defined by restraint. But there was one adversary no amount of discipline could permanently hold back: time. Unlike heartbreak, which can be carried silently, time announces itself through the body. And for Keanu, whose career had demanded physical commitment far beyond what most actors accept, that reckoning arrived slowly, relentlessly, and without drama. For decades, he treated his body as a tool of service, not a symbol of vanity, not a protected asset, but a working instrument. From the Matrix onward, he insisted on rigorous preparation. Martial arts training, wire work, firearms drills, precision driving, punishing choreography repeated until muscle memory replaced thought. Each role demanded not just performance, but submission. He did not approach action as illusion. He approached it as responsibility. If the audience was going to believe the moment, he believed his body had to pay for it. That payment accumulated quietly. Injuries stacked. Joints stiffened. Recovery slowed. Knees absorbed years of impact. Tendons tightened. Muscles that once rebounded easily began to resist. Yet Keanu did not change his behavior dramatically. He did not suddenly demand concessions. He adapted in silence, adjusting routines, adding recovery, learning the difference between endurance and recklessness. The myth of invincibility never interested him. What mattered was honesty. Then, in his 6th decade, reality intervened in a way that stripped away any remaining illusion of control. While working on a film project, a simple misstep caused a severe knee injury. The description was almost absurd in its ordinariness. A foot caught, balance lost, a sharp crack. No explosion, no stunt, just gravity reminding him that even legends fall the same way everyone else does. The injury was not fatal. It was not career-ending, but symbolically it was devastating. For the first time, Keanu was forced to confront a truth he could not train past. His will remained intact. His spirit remained disciplined, but his body was beginning to negotiate terms. Walking required care. Pain lingered. Recovery demanded patience rather than intensity. And patience, for someone whose identity had long been built on pushing forward, became its own trial. What makes this chapter heartbreaking is not the injury itself. It is the way Keanu responds to it. There is no anger in his words, no resentment toward time. Instead, there is acceptance. He speaks of listening to his body now, of choosing gentler rituals, swimming instead of impact training, stretching instead of strain, treating recovery not as weakness, but as respect for the vessel that carried him through so much. This shift reveals something essential about his character. Many people measure strength by how much pain they can ignore. Keanu measures it by how honestly he can acknowledge limits without surrendering purpose. He does not frame aging as betrayal. He frames it as reality. And reality, to him, has always been something to face directly. Fans have noticed subtle changes. A careful step, a brief pause before standing, a momentary wince quickly masked by composure. These are not signs of decline. They are evidence of cost. Every performance that thrilled millions required something back. Every cheer came with a bill that was deferred, not forgiven. Now the bill is being paid. What deepens the emotional weight is the parallel between physical and emotional endurance. Keanu has always carried pain privately. He does not announce suffering. He absorbs it. That habit, formed early in life, served him through grief. It now serves him through aging. He does not dramatize discomfort. He adjusts around it. He continues working, but with awareness rather than denial. In this phase of his life, discipline looks different. It is no longer about pushing harder. It is about choosing wisely, about knowing when to stop before damage becomes permanent, about understanding that the goal is not immortality, but integrity. He does not need to prove anything to the audience anymore. He needs to honor the work by staying present enough to do it well. There is something quietly devastating about watching a person who has endured so much now face the one enemy that cannot be outworked. Not because it defeats him, but because it reminds him that endurance itself has a horizon. The body that survived decades of sacrifice is asking for gentleness. And gentleness, for someone like Keanu, is not surrender. It is evolution. This chapter reframes the entire narrative of his life. The tragedies, the losses, the discipline, the restraint all lead here. To a man who understands that strength is not endless output. It is sustained presence. And presence requires listening. As he moves forward, Keanu Reeves is no longer defined by how far he can push himself. He is defined by how carefully he can continue. That may be the hardest transition of all. Not because it diminishes him, but because it asks him to accept that even the most resilient spirits must eventually learn to move differently. And in that acceptance, there is no defeat. There is only honesty. By the time Keanu Reeves reached his early 60s, the meaning of legacy had quietly changed. It was no longer about box office records, iconic roles, or cultural moments frozen in time. Those things still existed, but they no longer defined the center of his life. What defined it now was something far less visible and far more difficult to sustain. The decision to remain open in a world that had repeatedly taught him how dangerous openness could be. Keanu's story does not resolve itself in a triumph in the traditional sense. There is no final victory where pain is defeated and everything makes sense. Instead, there is continuity. Loss did not end his life, but it permanently altered the way he moved through it. Grief became something he carried rather than something he expected to overcome. And in that acceptance, he discovered a form of strength that does not shout. This is why people respond to him so intensely. They are not reacting to perfection. They are reacting to recognition. Keanu represents a version of adulthood that rarely receives admiration. The kind where you keep going without certainty, where you love knowing it may hurt, where you give without believing the world will reward you for it. His kindness does not feel inspirational because it promises happiness. It feels inspirational because it survives reality. In recent years, as his body began to show the wear of decades spent giving everything to his craft, another quiet shift occurred. He stopped trying to outrun time. He adapted to it. That adaptation mirrors the emotional wisdom he has practiced his entire life. When something cannot be changed, you do not waste energy fighting its existence. You change how you live alongside it. This philosophy extends into his personal relationships. After years of solitude and guarded distance, he allowed himself connection again, not with spectacle, but with intention. Love returned not as rescue or redemption, but as companionship, shared values, mutual respect, a partnership built on understanding rather than fantasy. For a man whose life taught him how quickly futures can disappear, this kind of grounded love is not a fairy tale. It is courage. What the public often misses is that Keanu's humility is not self-effacement. It is clarity. He does not believe he is above anyone else because life has repeatedly proven that no one is. He does not perform gratitude because gratitude is not a performance for him. It is a response to survival. When you have lost children, friends, partners, and watched family members fight for life, you do not need reminders to be thankful. You wake up already aware. As the years progress, Keanu's presence has become almost symbolic. He stands as evidence that masculinity does not have to harden in order to endure, that strength does not require domination, that silence can be generous, that gentleness can coexist with discipline. In a culture obsessed with extremes, he occupies the middle ground with rare conviction. The tragedy of his life is not that it contains suffering. Most lives do. The tragedy is that suffering never arrived with explanation or fairness, and still, he chose not to turn away from the world. That choice is exhausting. It requires constant self-regulation. It demands resisting bitterness, even when bitterness would be understandable. And it is repeated daily, quietly, without witnesses. At 61, Keanu Reeves does not represent the absence of pain. He represents the refusal to let pain become cruelty. He shows what it looks like when someone accepts that life is fragile and responds by treating people as if that fragility matters. This is not a lesson delivered in speeches. It is delivered in behavior, in patience, in the way he listens, in the way he steps aside to make room for others. Perhaps that is why his story feels beyond heartbreaking. Not because it is unbearably sad, but because it is unbearably human. It reminds us that survival is not about winning. It is about staying intact, about protecting the parts of yourself that make connection possible, even when experience suggests you should seal them off. Keanu's legacy, then, is not confined to film history. It exists in the quieter space between people, in the relief felt when decency appears where cynicism was expected, in the recognition that endurance does not have to erase compassion, in the proof that someone can walk through immense darkness and still choose to move gently through the light that remains. That is the final chapter of his story, at least for now. Not an ending, but a posture, a way of standing in the world. And for those who see themselves reflected in his silences, his pauses, his steady persistence, that may be the most meaningful role he has ever played.